This is the trap we're in that we say we want to build houses to bring house prices down, but the delivery models we have can only build houses when house prices are rising. And so we're stuck. It's an endless cycle that we're trapped in, unless you start talking about, well, what other models could we use to deliver housing? And some of that means public ownership, some of that means community ownership. All we really rely on at the moment are models which are themselves inherently reliant on rising house prices. And, politicians don't address that particularly because they don't have a way out of it. It's very frustrating the way sort of Britain has gone. We as a population have forgotten what is possible and what we could ask for. The idea that families wouldn't be able to afford to live on the street I grew up in was nonsense in the 1980s. And we've allowed it to feel normal. And so we don't ask for enough. But housing can be different.
You hear the word crisis a lot when it comes to politics and media. There's a climate crisis. There's a crisis of inequality. There's a crisis of masculinity. There's a crisis of technology, automation, and the future of jobs. But a crisis that really does affect millions of people in Britain already, in the here and now, is housing. That's been the case for more than a decade. The housing crisis is here, and it's only getting worse. But if the housing market in this country is broken and we want to fix it, we have to start by saying, when did it break? When did this problem start? And how might it just begin to get a tiny bit better? Today's guest is really a master when it comes to these issues. He's a journalist at Inside Housing. He's from Newham. Like one Gary Stevenson, dare I say, he's the Gary Stevenson of housing journalism. His first book, Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen, was published in 2022. It won the Orwell Prize for Political Writing a year later. Last year, we saw the publication of his book, Homesick, How Housing Broke London and How to Fix It. A one-stop shop in terms of understanding how housing went wrong in the capital, from before Margaret Thatcher all the way through to Right to Buy, Tony Blair, and austerity. So much important stuff is here. Like I say, Peter is a London boy, so he's also writing from experience. He's a West Ham fan. I won't hold that against him. Peter, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me.
We're talking to you today about housing. I mean, you are one of the best in the game when it comes to housing journalism. We've got Homesick, How Housing Broke London and How to Fix It. Let's start right from the top, probably with the most important political question in Britain right now, which is, why is housing so unaffordable?
I mean, I think that's probably a question that could take up the whole of the 90 minutes, to be honest. But I think there's just, it's unfortunately, like a lot of the things, like a lot of the complex political questions that we have, it's something that evades a simplistic answer. A lot of people would tie it to a historic lack of supply, because it is true that the British population has grown faster than we've built houses over the last 40 years or so. And that has an impact. But I think that certainly sitting alongside that, and I'd argue probably more important, is what's happened to housing financially during that time, and the kind of removal of the almost pressure valve of public housing and council housing as a way to relieve the pressure that people feel. So, when I was born in London, buying a house was something which was available to people with very ordinary working class salaries.
When were you born?
I was born in 1988, which funnily enough is the year when Margaret Thatcher's second Big Housing Act was introduced. So I'm pretty much the last generation of people born into a London which is affordable. And it's kind of, you can't really overstate how much London has changed in that following period of time. And the change is housing, because you see the banks changed their focus after that period from, most bank lending before Thatcher was to businesses, grow businesses, take loans out, start growing your business profits and pay the loan back. Since then, the banks have sort of moved much more into providing mortgages to people to buy homes. And obviously banks just create mortgages for people, and it creates this mechanism by which house prices can always be lifted because there's always available credit. So, lending on housing is much less to do with what people can afford or even how many deposits the bank holds. It's just a gamble that the bank is taking on the fact that over 25, 35 years, and the date keeps getting pushed out, people will be able to repay a loan, or that house prices will grow so that they can take the value of that loan back in a repossession. So because the banks start doing that, it creates this ratchet to send house prices up. And you can see that the house price growth always fluctuated throughout the 20th century, but it always stayed within a bracket of, between 3 and 5 times earnings. That would be the cap, because that's the end of where people can afford to pay. But once bank lending breaks that link between earnings and house prices can just accelerate. And that's what happened. I think you had 400% house price growth from the mid-1990s through to the financial crisis. And then what's happening secondary to that is that interest rates are falling around the world, including in the UK, which means that people are not able to get enough saved through a kind of workplace pension scheme to retire comfortably. And so they start to move their investments towards property instead. And that happens, pension funds do that at a large scale, sort of institutional purchasing of property, residential property, but people do it on an individual basis as well. And it only really starts from the mid-1990s. We have this incredible market in the UK of part-time landlords, sort of small-time, people owning 3, 4, 5 properties. That's the majority of our private rented sector. And before the 1990s, that didn't really exist. But if you think how much money people have poured into that, enabled by a banking system which is always keen to get more mortgage lending on its books, then of course the value of properties is going to rise, because what you're pricing now isn't the value of a home to someone who wants to live in it, a family who wants to live in it over a period of time. You're pricing it as an investment asset, either to an investor who wants to grow a buy-to-let portfolio, or a larger scale investor who wants housing assets to secure their investments over a long period of time. And so because UK housing is traded like that, and it's enabled by a banking system, house prices just grow, and they don't really stop growing. And the problem is that what we've done, that commodified a thing that everybody needs to exist and have a basic kind of comfort of life. And so we, as a generation born after 1988, are kind of living our lives in the wreckage of that, really, because you have to have a house, either rented or to buy at some point to give yourself a bit of security. And the only way to do that is to somehow compete with all of this investment money when your salary is never going to reflect that. And, I agree with you about it being the most important political question, because I think it sits at the heart of a lot of dissatisfaction. And a lot of the reason why people feel like the state doesn't work for them, or the government, the whole society doesn't work for them, is because you're asked to do this impossible thing, which is afford housing costs, which have been made unaffordable. You cannot live your life without it.
In that answer, I think you've probably covered about 6 questions I had for you, which is really good. But something you said right at the start was that now more retail lending goes to housing and property than to businesses, which is quite a new thing. I mean, that's extraordinary. The idea that we're now allocating more capital to people to buy houses, to inflate house prices, rather than to build bricks and mortar businesses, which ultimately, if you believe in Smith and Ricardo and free market capitalism, that is the thing that creates new value.
Yeah.
And it's really important to say we talk about housing bubbles, but the housing bubble in this country, really between, like you say, the mid-90s and the mid-noughties, was a housing bubble of prices. It wasn't like the Irish or the Spanish housing boom where you had lots of new units being built. Mm-hmm. It was a different kind of bubble. At least with those bubbles, there's a crash, and you've still got loads of housing stock left over. Or more recently, China. And then a few other things. I mean, that 400% price increase between 96, 97 and the global financial crisis, 2008, that is really extraordinary. And there are 2 thoughts in my mind just responding to that. The first is Tony Blair. When people say how great Tony Blair was, I understand why they would think that if they'd started that with a house in 96 and they ended up with a house in 2008. Because, of course, you've had an asset appreciate by 400% by literally sitting on your ass. I can see why you would love the guy so much. Equally, I'd like those same people to understand that if you aren't a homeowner, in 2026, it's perfectly sensible to look at that moment in time and blame him, blame the political class, as well as the people that come before them as well for your present predicament. Also, on Gary Stevenson, and it's something he said to me years ago, home ownership is not +1. You're not winning if you buy a house. You're just getting a 0. Right, we're all starting out now, because of the way the housing market works in this country, we're all starting out at -1. If you just want to get, on par, you need to buy a property, which is something you're repeating. And I'm not sort of saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. People make all sorts of arguments about, well, they rent in Germany and whatnot, or whatever. Right now in Britain, the way it works, just to be on par, you need to own a home. And then finally, the thing you said about smaller landlords, and I really want to talk about this later on because, interest rates are going up. Lots of those guys probably will be priced out in the years and decades to come. Lots of those guys were really dependent on record low, costs of borrowing, which is probably not going to be around forever. Well, it is, and it's over. And I suspect things will only get worse. We have a cap here at Novara Media, a baseball cap, hate landlords.
Right, yep.
And of course we hate landlordism, and even some landlords as well, quite bad people, especially if you read these books, you'll read about them. But it's also really important to say there are big macro variables here, which means that they were just sensible investments for these people. Other pension investments made less sense. If you were a builder, and I know a few guys like this, if you were a builder and you didn't pay into PAYE, you didn't have a private pension, but you knew how to do the electrics and to replaster and to do some bricklaying, etc., it makes perfect sense to buy a crappy property, have it as a side project, turn it into an HMO or a rental house or a rental flat or whatever. That makes perfect sense. And I don't want to demonize those people, but the reality is we now have, I think, 2.5 million circa private landlords in this country. And it's really creating huge social dysfunction, isn't it?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that the 2.5 million figure of landlords, and obviously it's not a main profession for a lot of them, but it means that is our country's biggest profession. So there's I think twice as many landlords as there are people who work for the NHS. And I think there's something in the region of 400,000 teachers in the country. So, you 8 times as many as them. And yes, I mean, I'd echo what you say, really. I think that, it's for a lot of people, and genuinely a lot of people, it is a economic circumstance which is presented to them as they reach their kind of 40s and 50s in the 1990s, which is suddenly the question of what your retirement's going to look like about that age becomes concrete when it's been abstract for most of the rest of your life. And you look at what's available in your pension, especially as we've moved to a kind of more low wage economy, and especially, like you say, if you're a self-employed person who might not have had the means to pay into a pension scheme. And this is really your only option. It's the only option that you're provided with by society, and it's encouraged. It's encouraged through the tax system, and it's encouraged socially as an aspirational thing to do. And it's obviously encouraged by the macroeconomy, which makes it a really good investment. And of course, people do it. You're thinking about your retirement, the future of your family. You're making, I guess, what is a selfish choice, but only in the same way as like all decisions to kind of secure some financial future for yourself are to an extent selfish. And so yeah, I mean, obviously a landlord who's leaving their tenants in sort of desperately poor conditions and, hiking the rents at every opportunity they can get and evicting people without any consideration for their circumstances is kind of very worthy of your baseball cap. But there is a wider social trend that drove us to this point where 2.5 million people made this decision. And they made it because it was pretty much the only thing that made economic sense for them.
And as landlords, are those kinds of people inferior as a tenant? Are they a worse kind of landlord than a big institutional landlord? Because I have to say, the best landlord I ever had, I rented for about 15, 16 years in London, over more than a dozen properties. The best landlord we had was a dude who had about 25 properties. I know It sounds strange, but he had 2 handymen, he had electricians, he had plumbers, and they came same day or next day. Whereas somebody, if it's just their bit on the side, it's their only property, my experience is those landlords tend to be dreadful.
I mean, you can certainly make that argument, and I imagine a lot of people listening to this, including me, actually would have had similar experiences. Being a landlord is actually a profession. it's a quite highly regulated profession these days, and there's very specific things you need to be doing to make sure the property is safe and suitable. A lot of people who got into it for the reasons I just described never wanted any of that, and don't do it. I mean, like, often when you're in those circumstances, you're dealing with a letting agent rather than a landlord who probably has retired off to Spain or somewhere, as you know, my experience was in one particular place. Larger landlords, then, especially once you get to the very, very large size of landlords, more kind of, which would be familiar to people in Germany and Berlin and so on, are a different entity altogether. And there are some advantages of that. They're easier to protest against, for example. They're easier to kind of, have a kind of organised renters movement, which can push for things like rent strikes and so on. It matters because you've got a body which you can fight. Whereas when you've got 2.5 million landlords, you've kind of got scattered fights with 2.5 million enemies. If you're talking about a tenants movement. And so there's that as an advantage. You can also regulate them much more easily. It's very difficult to regulate 2.5 million landlords. It's hard to enforce the rules. You know, you've got to find the people who are responsible for it first. And that in itself is hard. But then there are downsides to having kind of very large landlords as well, because it bakes in this kind of, this sort of system of renting housing and turning profit over from it becomes so much a sort of structure of the country's economy, and everyone's investments, well, not everyone's, but people who have investments will be tied up in that model. And so how you would really ever disrupt that once you get to that position is pretty hard to see. So, you know, there's definitely an advantage to having a larger landlord, both from the fact that you will probably be dealing with a professional operation of some sort, and if things do go wrong, you can hold it to account. But on a kind of economic level, it's probably not the road we should push down.
No. I'm just to be clear, I'm not advocating for asset managers, you know, like Blackstone and is it Slate Street to be replacing all these guys. I think there's an advantage in scale.
I think that is happening to an extent, though.
It is happening.
As you mentioned, the sort of interest rates making this a less attractive option. Some of the new legislation is coming in. And what's funny about that as well is if you look back to what when Thatcher made these decisions, what was said and some of the kind of documents around it, she expected that to happen. That was supposed to happen. It was supposed to be large money that came in and did this instead of the state. And the kind of the development of this kind of very scattered individualistic system of multiple small-time landlords was a mistake that the government has tried to correct ever since. And I do think that some of the feeling behind the sort of what is a very good policy in a lot of ways, the removal of no-fault evictions, is to try and push the market in that direction. And you can see it, you know, if you look at some of the larger, I think the largest landlords in some London boroughs now are property funds, sort of big global property funds who have been very slowly and quietly picking up these street properties as part of their portfolio. And we are moving, sort of almost sleepwalking into that kind of German-Irish model of having large funds owning a housing stock. It's a sort of drip thing, but it is going on.
Yeah, but Brett Christophers is the guy on asset management. We did a great conversation years ago now. I think it's got about 650,000 views because people have heard about these businesses, Blackstone, BlackRock, although they do something a bit different. But they don't know why they're pernicious. They know they're pernicious, but not quite why. And the thing that's really important here when you're thinking about asset management is closed funds. Now, what's a closed fund? Closed fund is basically a fund. You sell the idea of investing to various people into this fund. It'll be around a certain asset class, property in London or the UK or whatever. And it's a 10-year fund. So it's time limited. You go in, you come out, you get a return. Fabulous. And with Blackstone in recent years, very high rates of return. What that means is you buy low, you underinvest, you cut costs, you sell high, which is what I think BlackRock did with Thames Water, for instance. You know, they love natural monopolies because they can do the exact same thing. And that's going to be applied now to housing. And there's multiple examples of them doing that with housing elsewhere. I think in the US, some really powerful examples that Brett talks about in his book and also in our interview. And I think you're right. That's the next step, and it's something that we can try and avoid. You said you were born in 1988. You're a Londoner. Mm-hmm. Where were you born?
I was born in Newham.
Newham. How different was London in the late 1980s, but I suppose for you, really the early 1990s to where we are now, which is, of course, the mid to late 2020s?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a very different city. There's a danger of being rose-tinted about it because I talk about housing, and in a housing sense, it has absolutely got worse. Like I said a moment ago, the street I grew up on, my parents were able to buy a house on a single income. It's a fairly modest terraced house, but it was 2 bedrooms and a garden and a kitchen, which is just, you're not buying that as a family with young kids now, unless you've got 2 quite high incomes. And so all of my neighbours around on that street would have also been, some of them rented. It was, weirdly enough, it was quite a large private rented landlord that owned a lot of the stock around that area. But a lot of them had bought, and it wasn't, I only sort of worked this out with hindsight because it wasn't really something, I guess when you're young, you're not going to think about those things anyway, but I just sort of think it wasn't something that people thought about as much. Housing wasn't a thing that was top of your priority list in London because it was available. You've got to remember that by the 1980s, London's population had been falling decade on decade since the end of World War II. And so it was more a question of, there's too much housing, then there's not enough. We don't have enough people to fill it. So there were big social housing estates around at the time that were not yet impacted by the right to buy. And obviously what's happened in London is that the process of the right to buy, which obviously for listeners who aren't aware of that, is the process by which individual social housing tenants could buy their council home at a discount. Obviously in London now, that's sort of, a lot of those homes have been flipped over into private rental units and converted into multiple occupancy homes and so on. But you had a stable community. And so people typically who I went to school with, and, it was a very mixed ethnicity area, but people would, they would have had parents and grandparents who went to that same primary school. And so you had this kind of sense of like, there's a long established community that we're part of. I don't want to kind of, again, oversell it, but we would have known dozens of people along that street. You knew the names of their pets. We had next door neighbours who'd lived there since, I think, almost World War One. This was, teachers would teach children and then they teach their children. You were living in more of this kind of like connected community, and like as young people you'd kind of play outside your house and know other kids on the street, and their parents would know you and your parents would know them, and it had this feeling that I think has gone in London and sits kind of at the heart of one of the reasons why a lot of people in London are so miserable, is because you live quite an atomized sort of individual life now. Not all of that is to do with housing, because lots of other things have changed in society too. But the inability to kind of hold a community together, the inability to kind of join a community and feel like you're going to stay there for a couple of generations, means that those communities don't form in the way that they did. And London becomes a much more anonymous place. Now, I do need to say, London was far from perfect in those times. London was deindustrialized very, very rapidly in the sort of 70s and 80s. A lot of people were out of work. There was a lot of poverty. There was a lot of crime, much more than there is now, despite what you kind of see sometimes on X. And it was quite a sort of dirty city as well. It was unpleasant in places. Some people were leaving London because it wasn't that nice a place to live. It felt quite broken down. It felt quite sort of dusty and dirty. London has improved as a place in lots and lots of ways. It's much cleaner, much more breathable air now, and a much more kind of it has a feeling of kind of like people desire to be here because of all the kind of energy that there is around London, and that has come along in the sort of 30 or 40 years since then. But the other side of that coin is you might want to live in London, but it's very hard to, because it's unaffordable, and it's especially unaffordable for families. So yeah, I think sort of long answer there, but I think we've been in this odd sort of two-paced change as a city, in that you could say that the last 40 years have turned London into one of the greatest capital cities in the world, and you could say that the last 40 years have turned London into one of the worst capital cities in the world because of how hard it is to live in. And that depends really on your housing and your housing situation.
Yeah, I feel like London, there's two stages here. So I feel like basically for the working poor, working class people, London is, that's a very long story now, 25 years. But I increasingly feel like London is really, since 2010, but I feel like it's going into overdrive post-pandemic. It's just not a place for the middle class even, right? And you're seeing this, you talk about it in Homesick, about the number of families leaving, about the depopulation with schools. And of course, part of that is falling birth rates. That's a national phenomenon. By the way, in London, those falls are more intense than elsewhere. But it's important to say this is also a national story.
Yeah.
I'm from Bournemouth. I remember growing up, we lived in rented accommodation, but that was really unusual. I think about all my friends. I was at a grammar school, so it was a great way of seeing kids from all kinds of backgrounds, right? There were kids from wealthy families, from poorer families. In my mind, I had a great friend. His dad was a taxi driver, owned a house. There was another friend, his mum couldn't work. The dad did something with the council, groundkeeper, had a house. These were quite, humble jobs. And of course, that's just not plausible now. And that's happening right across the country, not just in London. And it does feel like a really significant shift, and one that I think the consequences are very much down the line, and it's going to hit us really hard. I also just want to say quickly, because you said you're from Newham, that 400% increase in prices for people that look at house prices as a function of immigration. And it's really important to say that the population of places like Newham or bits of central London weren't increasing by 400% in one decade. Right, so that should immediately undermine this argument. Yeah. Immigration can play a role, obviously. Supply and demand is a real thing. But I think that really buttresses your argument about the real shift here is about the financialisation of housing.
I think that the sort of the most comprehensive analysis of the impact of immigration on house prices is the immigration between the 1990s and the present day has added somewhere in the region of 3 to 4% to the average UK house price. But that's put within the context of 400% overall growth. So I think the thing is, one of the things, and actually this is a very kind of pertinent conversation at the moment, but the impact of immigration on housing in the UK is misunderstood and talked about in the wrong way, as is often the case with immigration as an issue. It's not really a relevant factor in house prices. You can demonstrate that from the numbers, as I've said. It's only a very fringe issue in terms of social housing because it's quite hard, especially as a new immigrant to the UK, to get allocated a social home. Obviously, people who've been here for 20 years or so would qualify under the same terms, but an increase, a sort of short-term increase in immigration isn't really going to have much of an impact overnight on social housing availability. It does impact private rented housing though. And so if you are kind of like, it's a funny thing because it's sort of tempting in the current climate to sort of point at things and say immigration has no impact on housing in the UK. And, that's, it's not quite true, but it needs to be put in the right place. And so, but if you think about what it means to say that immigration is, because most new immigrants, vastly overwhelming majority of new immigrants to the country will live in private rented accommodation. And that's typically the most expensive and worst accommodation that we've got available as a country. So then you actually are having a conversation about, well, people are being quite roundly exploited by private landlords, especially because, again, typically, and it's not the case for everyone, a lot of people will be coming in at the lower price points too. And it can cause pressure, especially in a particular area if there's a particular kind of reason why this area has suddenly seen a rise in immigration over a short term. Their private rented sector will get tight. The house prices won't necessarily change, and the social rented housing won't necessarily change, but there will be pressures in the private rented housing. And so, but like I say, it's a kind of misunderstood and, not properly talked about part of the story. But yeah, I mean, there has been a big rise in London's population, but it's nothing like the rise in London's house prices, that's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, we're looking, I think about the last time I checked from the sort of 1980 to today, I think it's about 2.5 million increase. And of course, we're talking about hundreds of percent increase in terms of the prices. I think it's really good you've said that about renting and social housing and house prices. I think you're absolutely right. There's very little data on the headline house prices, kind of, bearing any resemblance to immigration numbers. especially in terms of anti-migration sort of arguments say. But on renting, I think it's kind of indisputable. And then if you really drill down into renting, things like unlicensed HMOs. Mm-hmm. So I think Christopher Chope in 2020 asks Esther McVey, at that time the Minister for Housing, about unlicensed HMOs. She says there's about 76,000 unlicensed HMOs. We're talking potentially hundreds of thousands of people living in these unlicensed HMOs. Most of those, in my opinion, it's a completely unqualified opinion because we don't know, but I would suspect 50% plus whatever will be people not born in the UK. These are people, maybe you can recall data that is accurate and is in the public domain, but these were people that are in the gig economy, tend to be in larger cities or medium-sized cities, 0 hours contracts, etc., etc. And that is a problem because somebody might be, I live on a road just like this. It's just terrace houses. It's three bed houses. And all of a sudden, 20% of those houses are housing 12 people, not 4 or 5. And so it all of a sudden, of course, in terms of fly tipping, in terms of antisocial behaviour, it can completely change the character of an area. Of course it can. But I think it's really important to say that's a separate issue to young people in Britain can't get on the housing ladder. That's a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, that is how I see it as well. I mean, I don't think, the nature of unregistered HMOs being unregistered, I don't think there is good data on it. But certainly the reporting I've done and people I've spoken to, and just the kind of the fairly, you can make it's quite a clear case for why someone who arrives in the UK and works in the gig economy is going to find housing like that, and it does happen. And it's the street that my parents live on in Newham is now mostly, if not exclusively, HMO housing apart from theirs, and that doesn't make for a good...
in Newham.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it doesn't make for a good. But the thing is, I think what we're talking about there is it's all of these structures that are contributing to that, which are the gig economy, which are the wages that are available in the gig economy, which are the profits that can be made from housing in that way, which are the kind of, like I said, the removal of the pressure valve in terms of public sector housing. So everyone has to pile into the private rented sector. And all of those things contribute to this position that you find yourself in where, and then also the global economy, and then things that are happening globally and the difference between the wage you can, the real wage you can earn in the UK versus the real wage you can earn in most places in the global south mean that people will come seeking those wages, and then that's the only housing option they've got. But all of those trends create that, and then it just gets talked about in the context of immigration, which is you're only seeing one small part of a very, very complicated picture in why housing ends up being like that. But yeah, it is. I think you're right to say that can. It can create, HMO housing, whoever's living in it, whether it's a recently arrived immigrant or a British family who can trace their ancestry back to Boudicca. It doesn't make for a good, community to live in because people are transient and people are atomized, and that is that is not the way that kind of human beings thrive.
Yeah. Your book is called Homesick, and I think you sort of make a brief explanation as to why it's called Homesick. And I thought, this is an argument actually that would resonate with some people on the right, because, nostalgia increasingly characterizes politics in this country, partly because, or overwhelmingly because we've had, 15 very bad years as an economy, as a society. And so that sense of homesickness of a place that no longer exists is justified. And that just goes hand in hand with housing insecurity, the disestablishment of settled communities, etc. You can say that from the left or the right, they're kind of, both true. And I really do hope that, we're a left-wing show here on Novara Media, but I really do hope that people watching this, because I talk to a lot of these people who are, who don't necessarily politically agree with all my views, the Novara Media team's views, have a read of this, because there'll be stuff that you can take away from this as well. Let's talk about Maggie T.
Okay.
You mentioned 1988 as this really important moment. How big a deal is the 1988 Housing Act? And what does it do? What does it enshrine?
So the 1988 Housing Act is the one that deregulates the private rented sector. So before that point, we actually had rent controls in the UK, which were imposed as an emergency measure during World War I. They were supposed to be a short-term emergency measure, that resulted from basically from sort of workers' protests and rent strikes around the docks in Glasgow. And the government imposed emergency restrictions. Then they ended up lasting for 70 years. You also had pretty much lifetime security of tenure in a private rented home so long as you paid the rent. A variety of other... you had quite strong tenancies with quite clearly defined rights. The 1988 Housing Act destroyed that system and replaced it with the system which we only ended about 3 or 4 months ago, where all private rented sector tenancies were what are called assured short-hold tenancies, and so they end after 6 months or a year. And then they are either renewed or not, which is why people could be evicted regardless of whether they've paid the rent or whether they've fulfilled all their terms of their tenancy. You can still be kicked out at the end of that period. And what that does is obviously it creates an awful lot of personal hardship for people who can't find a settled home. And for people who've relied on the private rented sector in that period will be familiar with that feeling of I probably might not even get a gym membership because I'm probably not going to be here in 6 months' time. But then, that's also in a sort of more extreme sense, if you're trying to put your kids into primary school, if you're trying to retire, you're stuck with this kind of housing. But what it does from an economic position is it allows the market to always find the next person who can pay more rent. So if you can get rid of the existing tenant after 6 months, and you think that there's another tenant out there that can pay more than this guy, you can get rid of that person and put that one in. So it means that a ratchet system can exist, which means rents can constantly be exploited upwards. The market is always going to be able to price up and price out. And that didn't really exist before 1988. And so that means, one, housing becomes much more affordable, but two, housing is now... Unaffordable, yeah. Unaffordable, but now housing is this kind of, this really potentially lucrative investment asset, because if you think about what you're getting a profit on the rent. You're getting an asset that will increase in value over time in the house, and you're also having your mortgage paid by the tenant. So effectively, in 3 ways, you're able to make money from it, and it is the sort of lever which creates the growth of the private rented sector and the growth of the private rented sector, not through building new private rented sector homes, but through converting what would otherwise have been family homes into private rented sector homes. And that's really the trigger for all of this stuff that we've talked about over the last hour or so. It was Thatcher's second Housing Act. The first one included the right to buy, which I sense you might want us to come on to as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is really important because most people think housing, Thatcher, right to buy, selling off social housing. We'll talk about that. But you're saying, look, there's 2 parts to this. 88 Housing Act and that right to buy, that iconic policy, which, right-wingers still love to talk about. I mean, I did a thing with Camilla Tommy recently at the Daily Telegraph, and she said, surely you don't think right to buy was bad? And I said, look, I think home ownership is a good thing. I like home ownership. Yeah. I'm not against home ownership. But it shouldn't come at a cost of hundreds of billions of pounds to the taxpayer over decades, which is what's subsequently happened. So that's the 88 Housing Act. What changes with social housing with Thatcher and when? So 88 is private rental. Mm-hmm. Give me a timeline for social housing and right to buy.
What's quite interesting with Thatcher's social housing reforms is she does introduce the right to buy, which we'll come on to in a moment, but she also massively reduces the amount the government spends on both the maintenance and the creation of new council housing. But that doesn't actually start with Thatcher. That starts in 1976 with the Labour government, who, because of a series of economic crises not unfamiliar to people alive today in energy prices and global shocks and all that sort of thing, have to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund for a loan. And they are then required by the IMF to impose very serious public expenditure cuts through the next couple of budgets. And because they're in a position where, particularly because of the power of the trade unions at that time, they're unable to reduce public sector wages, they go for capital programs instead. And that largely at that point means housing. So the removal of kind of the post-war consensus of spending this money on council housing is attributed to Thatcher, but actually really comes from the IMF and the conditions it imposed on Britain when we took out what at the time was the largest loan any nation state had ever taken from the IMF in 1976, and it's done by a Labour government. You then have Thatcher 3 years later taking power in 1979, and she brings the same economic position of the sort of reduction in expenditure, but she also brings an ideological dislike of council housing, an ideological dislike of the idea that the state should be involved in housing whatsoever. And she continues those cuts and actually increases them to the dismay, it should be said, of other members of her cabinet. The cabinet is divided on this. They think that, council housing post-war was a cross-party consensus. There's people in the Conservative Party at that time who think we should be investing in council housing and building more, and Thatcher pushes against that and insists on a very, very, very serious level of cuts, almost to the ground, really, in terms of councils building new housing. And then what she does is she introduces this policy where existing council homes can be bought by the tenant who's there, and they're bought at a discount. But what's kind of really critical in that is that the discount, effectively, the banks can treat that as a deposit. So if anyone who's trying to buy a home will know the toughest thing to do is save up the deposit to get the mortgage from the bank. People who are buying under the right to buy don't really need to do that because the value of the mortgage is lower than the value of the property because of that discount. So the banks will lend to them without any meaningful deposit at all, really. So people just need to be earning a little bit more than they were paying their council rents in order to get a mortgage out and buy their property under the right to buy. And this starts slowly with a sort of couple of thousand sales, but then as we move through the 1980s, it's tens of thousands of homes going. And often it's the larger, more desirable council homes, the ones with gardens, the ones with kind of enough space for a larger family that are disappearing. I think to date we've sold 2 million. And as a result, we're losing. A lot of people who support the right to buy will say, well, the house doesn't disappear, and that's true. But what does disappear is its status as a social home, which people get lifetime tenancies in social housing, but they don't live in social housing for their entire lives. They'll downsize, they'll upsize, they'll move to a different town, they'll die, they'll, earn a bit more money and decide to buy a house or whatever. People will move out typically after about 12 or 15 years. That's the average length of tenancy. All of those 2 million homes should have, at some point, the family who lived in them would have moved out somewhere else and a new family would have moved in. And then that would have dampened the appetite for private rented housing, for HMOs, all of that kind of thing. We'd be using council housing instead. One of the things about Thatcher's decisions to do both of those things that I find particularly ironic, given the way that the sort of discourse is currently, is that Thatcher was intentionally increasing housing benefit expenditure. Because if you have someone living in a social home, even if they are on benefits, the benefits are quite low because the social rent is quite low. If you have someone living in a private home, housing benefit payments will reflect what the private rent is. And so quite famously, one of Thatcher's housing ministers was asked, incidentally by a younger Jeremy Corbyn MP, what the impact on housing benefit expenditure would be if poorer people were having to rent in the private rented sector instead. And the housing minister said that housing benefit will take the strain of the public sector moving out. They thought that it's okay to spend more on housing benefit because the state should get out of the provision of housing. And that then obviously what happens after that is that private landlords have basically the state is underwriting rent rises. So private landlords can now start increasing the rent and they don't even need to worry about whether or not the tenant can pay because the state's paying. So the state, from the early 1990s onwards, effectively bankrolls the increase of rents that happens around the country. And then we reach a position in 2010 when the Conservatives come back into power and they look at the amount being spent on housing benefit with horror and say, well, we can't possibly spend that much money on housing benefit. And so they cap it, but they don't cap rents. So the rents stay up there and housing benefit remains down here. And now people who need housing benefit can't pay the rent and become homeless. But that policy was manufactured almost deliberately as a way to move people out of public housing and into private housing.
I hope you're enjoying this interview as much as I'm enjoying learning from this interview. At Downstream, we are trying to create content which is informative and which can inspire change. These are the kinds of conversations, in depth, and like I say, highly informative, which frankly you can't find across legacy media. If you agree, I'm asking for one very simple thing. Click the subscribe button below. Doesn't cost a thing. It allows us to stay in touch. I mean, it's crazy. I'm very critical of the pension triple lock. And we can talk about that more later on, not least because it doesn't help pensioners who aren't homeowners, who are going to have a ton of problems down the line. But this policy, I think right to buy and how it coupled with housing benefit is really extraordinary. You've got a great quote. I've saved it on my phone. Here we go. Over a long period of time, homes let at social rents will pay back the debt taken out to build them through the rents, as well as generating long-term savings in housing benefit spend, as the millions currently claiming benefit to pay private rents move into lower rent social housing units. The country is expected to spend close to £60 billion on housing benefit. 60 billion, which will go to private landlords over the next 5 years. The government's own analysis shows that social housing pays back 69% of the grant used to build it within 30 years, so 70% of the costs are recuperated within 30 years, and 110% within 60 years. It's such a crazy false economy to have moved from the model we have before Thatcher to the one we've now fully embraced, and nobody, it seems to me, in political debate, apart from some quite marginal people, will say this. I remember even just until a couple of years ago, Angela Rayner was defending right to buy. And I'm just thinking, what the hell is wrong with you? This is crazy. And she's saying, well, people should be able to buy their own houses. That's great. Okay, well, let's work out a way of building cheap homes and people can buy them. Subsidise them if you want. But the idea that you'd get existing stock and sell it at a loss, and then your system, your mechanism is to basically have market rates which are subsidised by the taxpayer. You've got a taxpayer subsidy for private landlords. Crazy.
I think, and I think what's particularly mad about that is that sometimes it's the same house. So a house that was sold under the right to buy, built by the British, with investment from the British taxpayer, is then sold under the right to buy, but then is sold again to a private landlord and ends up as a private home in which people claiming private sector housing benefit are. So you basically just converted this home from somewhere where you could house someone spending, what is currently about £100 a week on housing benefit to pay their rent, to someone where you were housing someone and paying probably 4 times as much as that in housing benefit. And for what gain to the British state economically? It's only loss. It's a double loss because you lose the asset and then you lose the extra money you're spending on housing benefit. I think I will say, the point about sort of where you said some of the kind of commentators typically on the right and then Angela Rayner will defend right to buy. I think I think most people will know, probably whether or not in your own family or at least somebody who bought a right to buy home at some point in their life. Like of the older generation probably. I certainly do. And it's transformative for those people and they're very happy to have had it. And so I think sometimes there's a feeling that people don't understand that did good to the individuals and the families that benefited from it. But the reality is that's not, any state giveaway. The triple lock it does good to pensioners who benefit from a higher pension. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a good economic policy. Yeah. And I think Labour actually, I think they made a bit of a mistake with this really, because I think there probably was a time, maybe in the sort of Blair era, when lots of their natural voting base had either just got a right to buy home or were maybe on the cusp of getting one. Getting into the sort of economic circumstances where they might buy it. And if at that point Labour had been saying, we're going to take this away, they would have been putting a gun to their own head politically. And so I can kind of understand why they didn't do that at that point, even though I think it would have been the right and brave thing to do. I can understand why politically it would have been seen as damaging. I think then Labour kind of just carried on the muscle memory of that all the way through the 2010s, at which point I think one, their voting base changed, and two, the people who wanted to buy a home under right to buy bought it. And so they still felt that they'd have this, they just took this kind of school of political thought from the 2000s far beyond when it would have still been politically damaging for Labour to have moved away from the right to buy. And Labour has largely restricted the right to buy now, and they've done it very quietly by reducing the discounts available. So the number of right to buy homes being sold is sort of falling to a trickle now, but the damage is done really. And it's interesting you said that mainstream politicians don't sort of recognise the economic argument of council housing. I heard someone do it recently, which I was quite surprised and impressed by, which was Andy Burnham in his big speech on the economy. He set out in quite clear terms the what I was just talking about in terms of the way that local housing allowance or housing benefit has caused an inflation in private rents, and that it makes much more sense to spend that money by investing it in council housing instead. Whether that carries through into political action is another matter, because even though you sort of gave the numbers I quote in the book about how this money is paid back, it still sits as a one-off borrowing cost for the state, and that makes it difficult for chancellors to do it. But he at least rhetorically went further than other Labour leaders have.
That's very fair. And also, the Sunday Times last week, I don't know if you saw this, there was an editorial in the housing supplement saying we need to build more social homes, partly responding to what Burnham had said.
It's funny. Interestingly, The Economist went the other way and ran an editorial saying that we shouldn't, because they said it was fairer to pay benefits in the private rented sector, which I was quite surprised by from The Economist, because normally, they've obviously got probably a different political stance to Novara, but they're usually quite a kind of economically. I just felt that even on their kind of classical reading of economics, this would have looked like a worse way to spend money.
It's very ideological and zealous, which ultimately that's the background of the magazine. I think it's founded in 1832 by James Stewart. It's not James Stewart. James Wilson, as part of an ideological struggle with regards to corn laws and free trade and whatnot. But I think you're right. In more recent years, it's tried to be a very pragmatic centre-right publication. And
yes.
That didn't read like that whatsoever. There's a few points, really. So first is, I think for younger viewers and listeners, they'll think, well, council housing is horrible, it's nasty. We sold a lot of really gorgeous homes. A lot. I've got a good friend of mine, lives in southwest London. He's got West Indian heritage. His family bought the property they live in now. It's stunning. It's probably like £1 million property now. It's a turn of the century Edwardian Victorian building, many, many properties like that. And the thing you said as well about we shouldn't necessarily blame people. I certainly don't blame people that bought a property, because I was having this conversation with my wife. Her grandfather was in a council flat and he never bought the flat. He just wanted an easy life. He was a docker. He was a Labour voter in Malta. Working man, he believed in the idea of council homes, which didn't occur to him. But of course, I think any sort of objective analysis would say, well, look, this is the biggest giveaway of your life. You've kind of won a historical lottery ticket here. Use it. And we're pro-social housing. We're against that policy. And even we have those conversations. So there you go. And then finally, before we move on maybe from right to buy, and this is really important, correct me if I'm wrong, but local authorities didn't get to keep the money from the sales of the properties.
Yeah, that's right. That changed very slightly under David Cameron when he massively jacked up discounts and he let them keep a sliver of it. But under Thatcher, no. So you were selling the property, and then the Treasury was effectively just reclaiming that money and putting it into general government spend. So we weren't saying, okay, we'll sell this house and we'll buy a new one or we'll build a new one.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was just such a huge miss. I mean, it's like, if you'd have grown the housing stock by selling these homes off and building new ones, I'd have still probably been against it, but you would have certainly done less damage. And I think one of the things, and this is just sort of a slight side point, but just in terms of the sort of economics being wrong, is like it's going to be quite hard for Burnham if he does try and build council housing now, because the cost of building has gone up a lot, interest rates are much higher, and the maths could probably work, but they're going to be tricky. When Cameron and Osborne took over in the 2010s and had a very, 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 sort of probably even further than Thatcher ideological campaign against council housing and social rented housing, full stop, borrowing rates were absolutely on the floor in the aftermath of the financial crisis. There was a desperation for money to find things like council housing that was sort of state backed and secure, and assets, as they'd call them. And you could have built at that point. You could have built council housing almost. You could have certainly built it at a profit to the state over probably the medium term. And again, it's very frustrating the way sort of Britain has gone, in that we're now kind of trying a bit to increase our stock of social housing, and economically it's very difficult. And at the times when it would have been quite economically easy to do it, we just decided not to because we were ideologically against it.
Well, you're a very polite man, but I'll say it. Those stupid bastards on the free market right, they would say, they're not always stupid. On this, they very much are. They would say, well, look, we were running a deficit. If we spent more on things like building social housing, then the cost of borrowing would have been higher. The reason why we had low interest rates, low cost of borrowing, because we weren't borrowing more than we needed to. if you look at the first Starmer Reeves budget after they come in 2024, they jack up taxes a ton. What happens? The markets love it. Why? Because in the words of Gary Stevenson, he was sat right there a week ago. He said, look, markets love a high tax, low spend state. What they want is guaranteed returns on, when they're buying government bonds, they're going to get the money back. That's the main thing. And if you're saying to investors, look, we want to reduce our housing benefit bill, and we're going to do that through building up our asset spreadsheet, our asset portfolio with social housing. We're going to build 500,000 over 5 years, and it's going to pay for itself over a 55-year term. They would say, oh, wow, that's really smart by the British government. It means that, when I buy UK 10-year treasuries, or 10-year gilts rather, it's a much safer bet for me now because it means that their housing bill with housing benefit isn't going to spiral out of control in the future. Great. They don't seem to get it. I mean, maybe they do now. But I think that's the thing. One of the things that angers me the most, because we can talk about Thatcher or whatnot.
I mean, capital markets investors really like social housing.
They do.
I mean, sometimes in a way that you need to kind of keep them out of it a little bit. But like in terms of if a housing association in the UK goes to the bond markets to raise money to build new social housing, the investors are queuing around the door to invest in that bond because it is exactly the kind of thing that bond markets like. It's typically inflation linked, it's state backed, it creates an asset. These are things that investors want to invest in. If the British state was investing in them, they borrow from the bond markets as well, and the attitude would be no different. Yeah.
The whole thing about land, they're not creating more of it. Like you hear, business people say that. Why can't the state say it as well? Before we move on from Thatcher, I actually want to go back to the 70s because we've already talked about, I think, the Wilson-Callaghan government, the IMF, and that's a real moment, right? I don't think people realise this enough, that kind of that moment, 76, 79, precedes so much of Thatcher and Major and Blair. 79 isn't the snapping point necessarily for all of it. But there's also another moment. We're talking about the free market, right? We're criticising them. There's a lot of criticism to go around because I think in 1977, there's the shelter campaign to really change the complexion of who accesses social housing. So tell me, did do-gooders and did people like Shelter put one of the major nails in the coffin of social housing in this country? And how do they do it?
Well, that is a really interesting way of looking at it. So basically what changes in 1977 is we move to sort of what's called in the sort of housing world needs-based letting. And so you would be you effectively are looking when somebody comes to a local authority in a particular housing need, the local authority has a duty to house them. And that starts off in 77, as you say, with pressure from Shelter and the aftermath of that Ken Loach film, Cathy Come Home, which creates this sort of huge social movement around the injustice of housing, and the particularly for kind of young mothers and young children who would be homeless otherwise. And the thing is, I think you could look at that and say that's had some negative consequences later on, because it means that housing sort of becomes, the provision of housing becomes residualized to people in the greatest need. And that's, I think, but the problem is that policy works if you don't destroy social housing, basically, because if there's enough, then allocating it to the people in the greatest need first makes sense, right? Like,
does it though? If you're trying to, that's a bit like saying with the NHS, right? Oh well, we're going to give a better quality of care to the marginalised, which sounds great, but then all of a sudden you don't get buy-in from the middle class because they say, well, hold on, those people are getting better quality of care than I'm just going to go private.
I don't think it's so much giving a better quality of care as just triaging. If you went into an A&E with a broken finger and someone else came in with a heart attack, then the person with the heart attack would be treated first. But that it presupposes that the hospital has enough capacity to deal with both of you. And what we did is say we're going to triage housing, but we're also going to shut down half of our hospitals. So now you're going to have to patch up your broken fingers at home, and we're only going to deal with heart attack patients. And so I don't think it's the triaging that's the problem. I think it's the loss of the capacity to deal with the country's housing problems. At the same time as you then increase the country's housing problems by financialising housing and everything that we've talked about before, and make many more people in need of housing support. because that 1977 change comes in at a time when, as we've said a few times now throughout the episode, it's much harder to be in housing stress in the 70s and 80s than it is now. If you're a taxi driver, if you've got a stable job, if you're even, out of work for a couple of months, you might be fine. And so the world has changed a lot between now and then. And we've lost our social housing, and we've made it so much easier for people to be in housing stress, and we've cut away a lot of the other support networks, that now that creates a situation where, there's so little social housing, and it's only really something that's available as this kind of housing of last resort to people in sort of pretty desperate need. And, while I'd never argue that people in desperate need shouldn't get housing, I think it... that's not what council housing was ever supposed to be. The original ideas of council housing are that these are kind of places where all sorts of people come and mix into a community. And that's what kind of council estates originally were. I think it's one of the things I think is funny is like, you mentioned hospitals, but then there's also schools. Like no one ever questions the sort of state provision of education. You don't really get looked down on for sending your kids to a state school in the UK. And obviously, I don't know what the percentages are, but the vast overwhelming percentage of people do.
I think it's about 92%,
yeah,
right?
Something in that region. And so it's like schools are capable of not just being like, we're going to have state schools for the kids who are in desperate need. Schools are capable of being available for the kids who are in desperate need and the kids who come from middle class or even quite, upper middle class backgrounds and that's what housing should have been and once was. And so that change to sort of prioritise by need, again, we sort of made the metaphor of hospitals, but it's just like, if you could imagine state schools were only available to kids when they're from the most kind of disadvantaged backgrounds and weren't available to everyone else, then you're going to cause all sorts of problems.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bee in my bonnet with this stuff, because it's a classic example of basically the impulse for charity can actually undermine welfareism. Universalism is so important to if you don't have political buy-in from the middle class. This is why the NHS has lasted for so long, because it has tremendous buy-in from the middle class. Even though the Tories and the right-wing press have tried for years, it still has tremendous buy-in from the middle class. And, if you don't have that for a public service, then, it's not going to last for very long. And, I don't think it's a coincidence that an NGO and, sort of bits of the liberal intelligentsia do this, and I do think there's a sort of sociological thing going on where the post-war socialist argument was, this is for everybody, and if it's not for everybody, then, and they'd learned those lessons through real political struggle. Then we're not going to be able to build this kind of national service. And I think those all kind of forgotten by the 70s, actually, by parts of the sort of liberal intelligentsia. There's a quote, isn't there, from Clement Attlee? I think he says, charity is a cold, heartless thing. I quite like, I'm a Catholic. I'm meant to love charity. It's the highest virtue. But there's something to that. If you make a service just for poor people, it will become a poor service.
I think that's right. And I think there is a kind of sort of social democratic view of council and public housing that's still alive in quite a lot of European countries, that doesn't look on public housing in the way that we do, as kind of residualised service just for people in desperate need.
Yeah,
it is much more. This is just a mainstream part of living in this country, and some people need one level of support and some people need another, but it's available to everyone.
Yeah, you look at Bob Crow, for instance. He was RMT General Secretary. He lived in council housing. And that was a big part of his sort of political persona. He said, "Well, I represent working people. I've lived in this property. I'm going to stay in this proproperty." Whereas the Telegraph saying, "Well, you earn $100,000 a year. Why aren't you moving out?"
Every time the RMT went on strike, the Telegraph sent a reporter to his home to report that story again.
Yeah.
But yes, but that was the idea of council housing, is that you don't move out once your pay goes up. This is your home. That's the idea. So yeah, it's. I think it's true. I do understand what you're saying, and I do think that philosophical shift was probably unhelpful, but the thing that turned it into a disaster was the destruction of both the supply and the existing stock of council housing, and it wouldn't have been such a problem if that hadn't happened.
I think that's fair. Let's talk about New Labour. Was there a coordinated effort under Tony Blair and New Labour to run down council housing? I don't mean run down as in rhetorically run it down, but to actually let the quality of these places deteriorate in order to accelerate quote unquote regeneration?
Tricky one. You can certainly make that case. People who know that era would be screaming at me if I didn't mention the Decent Home Standard, which was something introduced by the new Labour government, which did create quite a lot of investment in existing council stock. But that always came with strings. So councils had to kind of hand their housing over to a private provider to get hold of it, or create an arm's length management body, or set up a PFI scheme or something like that. But there was still public money going into that. I think what that did more was kind of like, it was upgrades kind of like the inside of people's homes. So you get a new kitchen or a new bathroom, you get your windows replaced, that kind of thing. But what Labour didn't do was invest in the fabric of the estates, which at that time were, the big building programs after World War II. They're probably getting on for sort of 50 years old, and they do need investment at that point. Not just, in the pipes and the common areas and the structure of the building and the concrete and all of that sort of thing. And that funding is never made available, and neither are housing providers encouraged to do it. Certainly Blair and the new Labour government and the kind of urban task force that was set up around that time identified housing estates in larger cities, particularly London, as a place where they wanted to, what they would call, densify housing. They saw it as, we don't want to build out onto the green belt for various reasons. We want to densify inner cities. We've got these housing estates that were built, especially in London, when the population was much lower and falling, that were built quite spacious, sort of with green areas and so on. We could build thousands more homes on these estates. And their sort of philosophical approach to that was, well, we're not going to do that publicly with public money. We're going to partner with the private sector to do that. And then that, of course, comes with the problem that as the Blair era goes on, these estates aren't just, these estates become places of incredible real estate value because of the changing nature of London and other big cities, but particularly London. And so the private sector incentive to get in and knock these estates down and rebuild them as private housing, or as mostly private housing, increases and increases and increases. But this ideological idea that we're gonna build our new housing by densifying cities sits behind that and drives it. And then there is, in that era, certainly in the kind of local authority world, Labour local authority world, there is this kind of deeply stigmatizing view of social housing and social housing estates, and they sort of view them as problems to get rid of. And they would see a kind of a London borough as being improved by getting rid of a big housing estate and replacing it with private housing. And some quotes that really haven't aged well from some of the local authority leaders around that time.
Robin
Wales being one, who was mayor of Newham for many years. And so there's several things going on. I mean, I think the new Labour government does invest money in council housing, but it certainly wants to see council housing. It has a sort of a top level idea. I mean, Blair gave his first speech as Prime Minister from the Aylesbury estate in Southwark, which he describes in, I can't remember the exact quotes now, but he describes it, I think, as a sort of a place of no hope, where the only employment is in drug dealing and all of this kind of thing, and that he says we're going to have a new Britain. And so he sees that kind of post-war council housing as something he wants gone. And then you see some of the kind of the very worst examples of estate regeneration take place in that era. Estate regeneration is a complex thing. Sometimes housing estates can, whether through neglect or just through being built poorly in the first place, reach a stage where they're no longer comfortable places to live, and they probably do need to be replaced. Things do get, especially structurally, beyond the point of no repair. And so sometimes social estates are brought down and rebuilt, and that creates a more comfortable place to live. It's pretty rare though. And certainly what happens in the early 2000s is that this kind of ideological idea takes over, is encouraged by government, is sort of very enthusiastically adopted by some local authority leaders, and council estates that probably had, with a reasonable amount of investment, 50 years of life left in them, are emptied of people, demolished, and then rebuilt as largely private housing. And that, again, is a thing that changes the kind of face and character of London at that time, because you lose whole communities.
If you look at the Heygate estate, I mean, that's the real example for me. not the nicest estate, should be said, but the great thing about it was extraordinary parkland around it, so green in Zone 1, Elephant and Castle. And the estate wasn't nice, partly because it was, I think, run down by the local authorities. They could get rid of lots of people, but that happened over about a 10-year period, and at the end, it wasn't great.
Yeah, I'd say at the start of that period, I mean, thousands of people will have lived on the Heygate over its life. Some of them will have had a pretty rubbish experience of it, as is the case everywhere. It was built in a kind of brutalist style, which looks quite imposing and unpleasant. And like you say, it was run down. However, you don't have to look that hard to find examples of people. I mean, the person I spoke to, someone in the book who grew up on the Heygate and lived there for years, and his view on it is that it's neither positive nor negative. It was a place to live.
Yeah,
That's
the units inside are quite nice.
Yeah.
From what I've seen, I did go inside before it was all gotten rid of. But from what I've been told is that towards the end, partly because Peter Johns and Southwark Council just wanted to get rid of it. It wasn't particularly pleasant. They made it quite hard for tenants to get, from A to B, bits were closed off. And
I think some of the worst places to live over the last 20 years or so have been council estates that are waiting to be knocked down. And sometimes that can go on for a decade or more.
Yeah.
And at that point, they're miserable. But, even if they were good places at one point, a lot of people have moved away. The community's been kind of sucked out of it. The investment has completely stopped.
Yeah.
And they really, really, really do sink into pretty miserable places. But I think, again, it's like a lot of this stuff, the very frustrating thing about that is that never had to happen. And it comes from a kind of ideological view of council housing as opposed to, one which just says what's the best thing to do for the people that live in it.
And just to return to the Heygate, this was sold to Lend-Lease.
Yes.
I think for 50 million.
Yes.
And Southwark Council spent 45 million decanting people that live there. So you're giving, and this is, by the way, 1,400 units, I think, were there. About 3,000 people live there. So this huge, valuable piece of real estate in central London, the local authority made £5 million on it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, when I say criminal, I don't want to get sued, but it is metaphorically criminal. And yet somebody like Peter Johns, in terms of the I think you said local authority Labour world or local authority world, these people are lionised. They go to these lovely, soirees every year at Labour Party conference, Tory Party conference. They'll give themselves little pats on the back. This is an extraordinary misappropriation of a public resource. And nobody, people maybe like at Inside Housing or the occasional column in The Guardian might bring it up. But fundamentally, it's not mentioned in public discourse.
No, I think that's true. And I think it is, like you say, I mean, it's just, economically damaging, just in terms of not getting a very good deal. And the Heygate, I think for a lot of reasons, I think the Heygate is probably, if not the worst, one of the worst examples of that. I mean, I think that the thing is those deals were pushed through because of ideology, and there's no real doubt about that. Like I say, there are ways in which you could, there's parts of maybe particularly when you get out of London, there's sort of parts of the north of England where sometimes an estate can be in genuinely poor condition, very difficult to repair, and you replace it and take people out of sort of bedsit accommodation and give them a home. And it can be done in a way, it doesn't have to be done in the way the Heygate was done. And I think the Heygate is a particularly horrible example because a lot of the time, a lot of council estate regenerations give at least the social housing tenants the right to return. Sort of private rented tenants, leaseholders and so on are often do sort of disappear from the community. But you find, and it's very, very strange, but you'll see it around London, these kind of very expensive looking new build blocks, which are council housing now because they're on these regenerated estates. But on the Heygate, that wasn't the case. So social housing tenants were scattered from that estate and the community was gone. And I mean, it completely changes. Anyone who remembers Elephant and Castle before the Heygate was knocked down will remember it as a very distinctive place. It's Elephant and Castle was a part of London that had real character to it. And that disappeared with the Heygate, to my mind at least. I mean, obviously there's still some good stuff going on around there, but it's not the same place as it was.
It's kind of dead, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
it feels like that.
Walworth Road is quite a distinctive place still.
Yeah, true.
But East Street, but at the top of that road.
Yeah, and it's very, very, very expensive housing that Lend-Lease have built there. Incidentally, we might come on to this, but it later then becomes wrapped up in a building safety crisis. So what Lend-Lease built on that estate then needs to be remediated because they built it with fire safety defects. So you didn't get anything from that. Socially, politically, economically, it was. I mean, you said criminal. I'd say certainly it's an act of vandalism.
Charlie Chaplin from that part of the world, by the way, born on East Street. His autobiography is a very, very good book. Just talks about living in East Street and the market below and whatnot. And it's that part of London still feels like 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Particularly East Street Market. I think it's called the Good Intent, that pub, and it's very, different. There's a few pubs that are very much like they were before, but you have this bizarre sanitized sort of neighborhood with that redevelopment right at the top of Walworth Road, which is it's like a kind of cultural dead zone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, if you think like people who live there, and it's the same at sort of at Nine Elms, which is a big development that wasn't ex-council housing, but in Battersea, is like you're not living there to be going down Walworth Road to do your shopping or to go in the pubs. You're living there because it's got close proximity to a tube station. So the only involvement you would have if you live in one of those flats with your local community is the sort of 3-minute walk from the lift lobby to the tube entrance, and that is what those parts of London feel like. There's this kind of this community that sleeps there, but they live their lives somewhere else. And yeah, certainly I think Elephant and Castle is that part of Elephant and Castle anyway, where the Heygate used to be, is one of the more extreme examples of that.
Do affordable housing targets work? So you were talking about the spectacle of brand new developments and one tower amongst half a dozen, maybe for social housing or whatever. Does this work? Because you have some people on the right, sort of free market fundamentalists, say no, this is bad because it means we have fewer units built, so we have less supply. What's your view?
I think yes. I'd say they work. I think they haven't. I mean, we started. There was a period when Ken Livingstone was mayor in the 2000s, when he wanted, especially sort of sites that were on public land or had GLA support, to be 50% affordable housing. And then the global financial crisis hit and all of that fell apart. And then you had Sadiq Khan come in 2016 with exactly the same promise, saying that we were going to get 50% affordable housing, lots of social rented housing in all developments. And then the next economic crisis have hit, and immediately that's been unwound as well. I think where I would say they do work and should work and could work is if actually you took a much more stringent approach to it and said, there is nothing going to happen on this site without 35%, 50%, whatever, because then that affects the land price and the amount the developer pays for it at the start. So if and this is kind of, I'm oversimplifying slightly here, but this helps places like Vienna have very high proportions of affordable housing because they just zone that into the planning permission. And then if a developer comes into a part of Vienna and wants to build a housing development, they don't have any choice. So they pay for the land a price which is appropriate to deliver 50% affordable housing, and then they deliver it.
This is really interesting. So hold on. Imagine I'm Tom Harwood.
Yes.
Right? He's like, free market YIMBY. He's saying, but what that means is the developers won't build.
Yes.
And then we get less supply and prices go up, which we don't want to happen.
Well, I mean, the sort of category of developers we have now might not build, but I mean, if that land cannot be done, if nothing else can be done to that land, why would somebody not want to take the profit that you can take from the smaller amount of private housing you can build on it? What happens at the moment is speculative development, which is you buy the land and then you try and develop it in the way which is the most profitable, and that means negotiating down the affordable housing, negotiating up the density, etc., to go from position A to position B in terms of the profitability of the site. But if that's not an option, then you have this conversation much earlier in the process, and there isn't any value to a large house builder to say, well, we're going to pass up on this site until we think affordable housing requirements are falling, because that is baked in. But I think it also does come down to sort of questions of what are we actually trying to achieve? Because if what you want is an overall volume of housing at all costs, then maybe Tom's right. And in certain parts of central London, you're not really going to get an investor coming in and putting the money up unless they can make an extraordinary amount of money from it, because there's risk involved. And so this has to be worth their risk. That risk means a certain level of profit, and therefore this site will only be developed if high profit margins can be made. But then the question is, well, what did we do there? What did we achieve with that land in the center of our big city? What did we do to the city with that land? What was it a good thing that we got this sort of 50-story tower? Has that actually decreased property values anywhere? Tom would then tell me about the vacancy chain effect, which is a sort of the YIMBY version of trickle-down economics, which says that someone who would have moved into a private rented sector home somewhere else moves into this big tower block instead, and then that frees up a vacancy, that frees up a vacancy, and that frees up a vacancy. But the thing is, that is, even in the kind of economic analysis which supports that idea, that is a very, very, very weak transition. So there's it's not spatially bound because anyone can move into this flat from anywhere. So where you create the vacancy is almost impossible to track. And it doesn't account for the desire of investors to buy 2, 3, 4 properties in this building. So you're not creating the vacancies that you should. You're not transitioning housing down over any kind of definable time period to people who are in need. What you're really doing is taking away prime developable land in our city, because once something is built on it, and particularly once that land is sold for a certain level to a certain type of investor, nothing else can be done to that land. And so what we should be doing is going, okay, let's look at London or any city like it. What is the developable land in London? And then what does this developable land need to do for our city? And then what mechanisms can we create to make that happen? Can we give some of it to a community land trust or cooperative? How much of it needs to stay in the public sector? Can the public sector gain more land so that they get control over it? But if the only delivery mechanism that you have, which you do if you're Tom, is the free market, then you're going to end up in that position. But you have to be smarter than that, because otherwise you end up with outcomes that don't benefit anyone.
So how do we get more housing? I mean, you're saying we need to increase the in terms of social housing. You're saying we need to increase the targets or the demands 35, 50% in terms of social housing or affordable housing. What else is there though? Because I mean, that's going to help with affordable and social housing, but that won't necessarily help with increases in supply. Do we need to increase supply, or is that just a complete false?
I mean, I think sometimes too much emphasis is placed on increasing supply, and there are economists out there who would say you don't really need to worry about increasing supply. What you need to deal with are the kind of the demand of housing to investors and other sort of demand side interventions rather than on the supply side. I kind of split myself between the two. I think that that's true, but then I do think that there is a fairly obvious case to be made for supplying more housing as well. And then I think, people say you're not making more land, but the major land use in this country is cattle farming for beef. That's what we use most of Britain's land for. We should be and could be looking at areas of the so-called green belt and thinking, well, is this an appropriate place to build new housing? And you can be too simplistic with that, because there's no point building a housing development in the absolute middle of nowhere where no one wants to live. But there are spaces on the outskirts of all major towns and cities, including London, which could easily transition to housing. But now when you do that, you have to do it in the way which I just described, which is when that land use changes from being agricultural to residential, you don't just allow it to massively increase in value and provide profit to a speculative landowner. You say this increases to residential with 50% affordable housing, social housing on it. And then you are able to increase our housing stock. There's more than enough land on the outskirts of cities, particularly around kind of train stations and so on, where we could build plenty of housing. That's not our problem. The problem is that delivery mechanisms we have to do that are entirely reliant on volume house builders and a free market model which can only view it through how much profit can I make from this. And that's what holds us back. And that's why now, if you kind of did bring that land available and make it available, you just push it into that same system and people will buy it and hold it and trade it and drip the houses out over a period of decades and not change things. But I don't know if anyone's ever been on the district line east of Barking, you'll see lots and lots and lots of very similar housing flashing past the window. And that's the Beacontree estate, which is massive. It's I think it's the largest, it certainly claims to be the largest public housing estate in Europe. It was built between the end of the First World War, and so it's built in the interwar years. A lot of people for sort of big Ford factories and docks in the area. And the housing there, I mean, you know, the Beacon Tree estate has its issues, as does everywhere, but like the housing there is great. I mean, it's like, you know, this classic sort of brick built housing, a lot of it's semi-detached and detached with gardens and these little kind of like cul-de-sac-y places. It's a good place for communities. It's one of these houses where it's like they're so sort of densely built that you can barely hammer a nail into the wall, and they're still in quite good condition. You know, now more than they've celebrated their centenaries, and more than 100 years old, those houses, and still going and still desirable. And we did that because after World War One, we changed that area from being a place where which we didn't really need for agricultural purposes anymore, into one where we built social housing and did something which has now lasted for 100 years. And we did that obviously when the country was much poorer and, you know, sort of crippled really by the impact of World War One, and managed to do it still through the kind of Great Depression in the 1930s and all of the kind of economic upheaval then. You know, we've forgotten that those sorts of things are possible. But in relatively recent history, they were.
I think the whole obsession with the free market is the major obstacle for us. You know, I live in Portsmouth, and if you go to Portsmouth South East Station, you've got an enormous car park, literally next to the station. Nobody's there. You've got these enormous brownfield sites, and you look around, you think 10, 15, 20,000 people could live here quite easily in a medium-sized city, hour and a half to London. There's demand for housing here because the HMOs are mushrooming across the city. Yeah. Rents are really high. And so there's clearly some sort of market failure going on. Yeah. And this is what I don't understand with the centre-right, is that, you know, this is not a problem of regulations, because, of course, if you go to somewhere like Nine Elms, they're going up, right? They're zooming up. And that's not happening in lots of the country. Or if you go a bit further up to Havant, I think Havant, look, this is an hour and 5 minutes to central London. It's a dump, you know, and right next to the train station, there's just so much land, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. I think the paradigmatic example for me, which you mentioned in the book, is Ebbsfleet.
Yep.
You know, this is a place which is a little bit more than 10 minutes into London on HS1, so amazing transport connections. You know, if you're in the world of Tom Harwood and the free market right, this should be the fastest growing city in Europe. Yeah. You're next to London, amazing transit networks, and yet it's not happening. And to go back to a phrase you said a while ago, that's because of the drip effect we get from developers. They don't want to build 20, 30, 40,000 homes in 5 years, because that means the price of those homes will fall. But a slower introduction of supply means you still get those returns, and it's a better bet for them as a private enterprise.
Yeah, completely. And the thing is, what's quite interesting is a review of housing, a government commission review of housing, particularly on large sites, came to almost exactly the conclusion that you've just described. And that review was commissioned by a Conservative government and carried out by Oliver Letwin, who was obviously one of the kind of ideological minds behind Margaret Thatcher's economic policy. So that is an obvious conclusion, even to people who would start from a very different political viewpoint as you. But yet, you know, we are stuck in this. I think the thing is, basically to sort of answer the question you asked about supply, I would support measures to increase supply only if they came with new delivery mechanisms to make sure that supply wasn't simply ways to get more land into the balance sheets of the volume house builders, which often is what actually happens. I think that the majority of kind of the sort of planning reforms that came in under Keir Starmer, he would have thought were there to reduce house prices for the next generation, and were actually there to increase the amount of developable land which was owned by the larger house builders. That's what they were trying to achieve. And they were able to persuade him to do it. You know, if we're going to increase supply, we need delivery mechanisms that make that supply work in terms of the outcomes we want. Supply isn't an outcome we want. Supply is supply. The outcome we want is more affordable and secure housing. And so you have to ask, well, how does this supply create that outcome? And there's ways to do that. But we don't ask that second question. We just ask, well, I say we, not us, but, you know, we as a country and we as a kind of commentariat and we as a political class really just ask the question, how can we increase supply? And that doesn't really get us anywhere.
There's a great stat, again, in Homesick, where you talk about how much is spent on Help to Buy. So not Right to Buy, Help to Buy, which is basically 2010. Well, it doesn't start in 2010, but 2011, I think, to 2015. It's the coalition government. And I didn't know. I mean, these are loans, okay? So this isn't just going down a black hole, but it's still the amount of money that government's making available. 24 billion is spent on Help to Buy, I think, and that's a 24 billion pound subsidy to keep house prices going up.
Yeah, totally.
It's crazy.
Well, I mean, it's funny. As soon as interest rates in the 2020s started to force house prices into slight decline, or at least kind of stability, the house building lobby went straight to Keir Starmer and said, we need a revamped Help to Buy because we need house prices to rise in order for us to build. And so this is the trap we're in that we say we want to build houses to bring house prices down, but the delivery models we have can only build houses when house prices are rising. And so we're stuck. It's an endless cycle that we're trapped in, unless you start talking about, well, what other models could we use to deliver housing? And some of that means public ownership, some of that means community ownership, but it means all we really rely on at the moment are models which are themselves inherently reliant on rising house prices. And like politicians don't address that particularly because they don't have a way out of it. There's not. And the other thing is, what really drives that kind of housing policy in this country is that the Treasury are hooked on it because they need to see an increase in house building in 5 years projected in order to make their borrowing calculations work. And if they don't have that, then suddenly Rachel Reeves or whoever it is next has less headroom to borrow this year. And so they need to keep convincing the OBR that house development is going to climb. I mean, I think, echoing back to a previous part of the conversation where you said that the reason, about the Cameron and Osborne era, it was Help to Buy was the only thing that got us out of recession. If you remember the first couple of years of that government, where sort of all these austerity cuts were coming in and the economic picture was getting worse and worse and worse with every kind of new update. And then sort of the mood changed and things started to lift. But what we were doing is the same thing that we did in the 1990s and 2000s, is kind of create false economic growth by raising house prices. And that's all it was. And then it stopped and now we're back here.
I'm going to go Matthew McConaughey in Wolf of Wall Street. It's all a Fugazi. That's the UK housing market, but particularly during the coalition years, it is all a Fugazi. So if you look at the three things that mean the Tories get a majority in 2015, this is really key. Because a lot of people said at the time, well, hold on, you have a hung parliament in 2010. This is the first Tory majority since 1987 in 2015. How did you do that? And you're doing a bunch of things in terms of austerity that were really unpopular. How did you go from a hung parliament to a majority between 2010 and 2015? 3 reasons. 1, low interest rates. Really low interest rates, which means that, Terry and Tina up in post-industrial part of the northeast, okay, the economy is not booming, but they can get a cheap mortgage, they can get cheap car and HP, they can buy a cheap washing machine, cheap fridge freezer, cheap white goods. Good for them, by the way, right? So that can massage certain sort of macroeconomic things that aren't going so well. That's number 1, cheap interest rates. Nothing to do with them, by the way. That's just part of where we were in this, the lowest interest rates for 300 years, actually. That was a global phenomenon. And number 2, Help to Buy, this £24 billion stimulus. And number 3, the pensions triple lock, which was the biggest political bribe we've had in this country since 2008. Actually, I think the second biggest political bribe ever since Right to Buy. And then, so you've got triple lock, which is going to basically, over the course of its lifetime as a policy, and we can't keep it. Maybe we can talk about why, but we can't keep it. People get really angry with me over this. We can't. In an aging society with falling fertility rates, you can't have a permanent shift of capital and resources to older people who aren't in work. You can't do it. Maybe if we have, the retirement age at 70, I don't want to do that personally, right? So these are big bribes, 24 billion on Help to Buy, tens of billions on the triple lock. And then people say, oh, you can't let the Labour Party in with Ed Miliband. They'll spend more money. It's happening. But ideology means we can't really talk about it. I do want to talk about the triple lock very quickly because I can hear people watching and listening to this. They'll be screaming. They'll say, Aaron, how can you say this pension poverty is so bad in this country? Yeah. It's a really good thing. And I think there's a part of a chapter in Homesick which really brings home why we need to get rid of the triple lock. Because pensioners in this country who aren't homeowners are screwed.
Yeah.
You know, we are sitting on a time bomb where hundreds of thousands of people in their 70s and 80s will be sleeping on streets, right? If we carry on in the present direction, which is to say defunding local authorities who therefore can't help them, and older people who don't have assets, who still, you know, who probably still have to work in order to rent, because that triple lock pension, it's great if you're not paying rent, you're not paying your mortgage, but if you're paying rent, it's nowhere near enough.
Yeah, totally.
And I would say, well, look, we get rid of the triple lock, you still index it to wages or to inflation, and you spend the money you save on social housing for older people. But anyway, that time bomb, and we're towards the end now. People always think, oh my God, you're still going on this poor man, let him go home. But this is a really important one for me. That time bomb of older renters, how big is it?
I mean, this is a thing that people don't talk about in this country and should talk about, and it's this issue as generation rent grow old. It's like I say, there's a chapter in the book where I talk about it. Basically we've had one cohort sort of start to tiptoe into retirement without, because we have the triple lock in this country, but really what we have is asset-based welfare. So you have paid off your mortgage by the time you retire, and then that pays for your dementia care if you need it. That's really how retirement works in Britain. You know, like you say, the triple lock is something of a bribe to pay for your cruise.
And the pension, the cruise and the Waitrose shopping,
but
right?
the reason you have security in retirement in Britain at the moment is because you have an asset, and the asset is yours. And that's why people are so desperate to get on the housing ladder. Like I do think that the pensions and retirement and housing, they walk in an odd sort of lockstep, because it's also pension funds that invest in housing, and people invest in housing for their pensions. But what's starting to happen now is people have been through this era from the 1990s and not got on the housing ladder, and are now hitting retirement age. And so aging out into retirement without an asset. And there's very sad stories, 2 stories in the book. There's a gentleman I met who was he's sort of just on spareroom.com, you know, looking for like room shares with young people, and he's a nice guy, but he's tired and he's in his 70s, and he that is not appropriate housing for him. And then a woman who she worked for the civil service for most of her life, renting privately, and then when she retired and the landlord put the rent up, she couldn't afford it, and she was kicked out of London to the sort of outer reaches of northeast England. And as you said, it's a time bomb, because with every single demographic that goes past, the number of people in that category rise, and they rise very sharply. I can't remember the figures exactly off the top of my head, but it's sort of in the tens of thousands now in terms of private renters over 65 and into their 70s. And then, but the cohort below that is of people aged between 55 and 65 is in the hundreds of thousands. And then people aged between 45 and 55 are in the millions. And some of those people might inherit money and they might get a home at some point. But I think after 55, you're very, very unlikely to get onto the housing ladder if you're not already. And so those people are going to retire, and they are going to retire into pretty abject poverty. You know, it's difficult living in private rented housing as someone in your 20s or 30s. It's impossible to live in private rented housing as someone in your 80s and 90s. You know, the issues that you have dealing with landlords and dealing with disrepair and moving house so frequently, you know, are going to be much, 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 much harder to deal with in older life. And it would reshape the vision that we have of what retirement is, and it will be another break in the social contract. You know, like this idea that you can't get onto the housing ladder is a big break in the social contract. Another thing that we feel like we're promised for working hard our whole lives and, you know, following the rules is a comfortable retirement. We feel like that's something that should happen to us, and as that starts to not happen to larger and larger numbers of people, that will become a problem that is very difficult for society to cope with, I think, because it doesn't work. Private rented housing for the older generation is, you know, you could reform it and change it, but, you know, those are big reforms. But I agree with you. I think that money is lavished on pensioners that don't need it, while pensioners who really do need it need a higher rate of housing benefit at very least, or ideally an age-appropriate social home, are being sort of thrown to the wolves at the moment.
Yeah, I think what I would do is that, you know, you talk about municipalisation and the state basically, you know, grabbing assets, buying them or seizing them if people break the law, maybe, if it's an unlicensed HMO. But, you know, I thought, oh my goodness, we've got all these HMOs. If you had a socialist government, you would turn all of them back to family homes or to flats. But actually, and then I thought, you know what, actually probably would keep some HMOs, because if you've got this older population, maybe they don't have kids, or they might just have one kid, they live in a different part of the country, that'd be quite a nice place to grow old in. You know, if it's, like you say, it's maybe not all of the units would say because they're overcrowded, but maybe you might reinstigate a common room, a lounge and whatnot, and 4 or 5 older people could live there in social housing. It'd be quite pleasant.
I went to somewhere like that, which I talk about in the book as sort of one of very few kind of more positive examples that there are in there. And it's a specific one. It's in quite central London, actually, for it's an LGBT retirement property, because, you know, LGBT people retiring at the moment typically will have less children because of the age they lived in. It was much harder to adopt as a gay couple. And so they don't have the sort of children and grandchildren and so on, typically, that other couples might have. And also, you know, a retirement home might be a difficult place to be a gay man or a trans person or whatever. And so it's this place that it does operate a bit like that. It's these flats, and they have a great time.
I bet they do.
Yeah. But it's a really positive place. It's a really positive place. And things like that, they are possible to create. You know, that was an affordable housing contribution that was imposed on the developers. You know, that's an anti-free market policy. But it's created a retirement community for people who really need it. And we can do more of that. Like I think one of the real problems with housing policy at the moment is that we as a population have forgotten what is possible and what we could ask for. And all of this stuff that's happened over the last 35 years, which was unimaginable, basically, to you know, the idea that families wouldn't be able to afford to live on the street I grew up in was nonsense in the 1980s. And we've allowed it to feel normal. And so we don't ask for enough. But housing can be different. And you know, that's a good example of it. We could do an awful lot more of that.
Yeah, and that happened under Sadiq Khan. Right?
Yeah. I mean,
not a particularly radical dude.
To be honest, I think that might have actually happened under Boris Johnson. I mean, there's, you know, we're still getting small things and being grateful for them, but we should be asking for much more of that, and should expect much more of that, because it's possible, and it's political decisions that stop it happening.
Yeah, and this is the thing, you know, once you have a couple of dozen of those kinds of examples around the country, people can start to work on a prototype. So sticking with this, because the time bomb of older renters is scary. I've thought about it a lot. But then reading this page, you know, really brought it home. The collision is rapidly approaching. Making it sound urgent. It has always been hard to get onto the property ladder after 40, but the recent rise in mortgage rates since 2021 has made it even harder. This means that many of the renters currently in their 40s and 50s will retire as renters. The number of private renters in the 55 to 64 age group has increased faster than any other group, growing 6 times the rate of that of the population as a whole in the last 10 years. That's crazy, right? And I didn't know this. Average earnings typically fall after the age of 50, which leaves this immediately pre-retirement cohort with no real option but to carry on renting. The estate agent Hampsons projects that the number of older renters will pass 1 million by 2030. 1 million. Noting that, quote, this trend has the potential to shape the country socially, economically, and politically. So 1 million people who are older and renting, we're going to start seeing tens of thousands of people rough sleeping in people's front rooms in their 70s and 80s. I mean, this is a really serious thing. And it's one thing to be, as you've already hinted at, really, and you talk about in the book, it's one thing to be generation rent, and like yourself or like me, I moved, like I say, 12, 13 times in 15 years. It's one thing to do that as a 26-year-old who goes to the gym every day. It's another thing to do it as a 75-year-old with rheumatoid arthritis. It's not possible. It's a horrible existence at the best of times. How do we prepare for this?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, there's so many. It's like when you're in that state of being older and more vulnerable as your health declines, you need that community, sort of sense of community even more. You know, so the things that housing have taken away from us, the kind of neighbourly relationships, those are the people who really lose that. You know, someone who needs someone to do their shopping for them or needs them to check up on them occasionally. You know, like there's a very, very sad example recently in social housing, not private housing, of a woman dying in a social flat and not being discovered for 2 years. And I think that sort of thing will start happening because people won't know their neighbours and won't know these, you know, won't have those relationships. I mean, there isn't really a way out of that. I mean, I think what it will do is housing policy has kind of shifted, and you mentioned it maybe for the negative reasons in the 1970s with the big campaigns around Cathy Come Home and so on. When people kind of suddenly see this, and it's usually children or people rough sleeping or older people suffering, kind of sort of nudges us out of our sort of numb state towards this, and does make people say, well, this can't carry on. So whether it's ideally it would be through the provision of enough social housing that people who don't retire with a paid off mortgage have a safety net of a social home, but at very least it needs to be housing benefit that reflects the cost of renting. Whether that's just for older people or for everyone. But what you can't do is what we do currently is, housing benefit is lower than rents because people are supposed to be incentivized to go and get a job, which doesn't work when you're 85.
No.
So
it's the workhouse principle, right? You have to make it worse than work, so people go to work rather than go to the workhouse.
But that presupposes that everybody who's in housing need is of working age.
Yeah.
And that's not the case, and it's never been the case. But it's that problem is going to get greater. So either we're going to be pouring more money into it because it's effectively increasing the pension, but with a different name, or we're going to build more social housing so that those people can retire comfortably, and communities like the ones I described, that can look a little different and in a positive way from just general housing. You can build really lovely retirement, and not everyone wants it. Some plenty of older people I know would absolutely hate to go into a retirement village or whatever, but they can be really good places to live, and we can do that. I think then again, some of the question comes down to the triple lock, in that people might be saying, well, we can't afford this. And it's like, well, we can, we're just spending the money in a different way. If you remove the triple lock, you can keep other pensioners out of poverty. And as we've seen, there's going to be 1 million people private renting. It's very hard to see how you can be a private renter and a pensioner and not be in poverty. I don't think that those two things are possible, because you, by definition, don't have savings. You, by definition, don't have security. And so, and you, by definition, don't have enough money to pay the rent. And so that's basically saying 1 million pensioners in poverty by 2030 and rising every year from then on.
You talk about the numbers. I think it's something like you need on retirement, which is, now mid to late 60s, you need around £450,000. I think in the book you say. And of course, if you have that much money, you're going to buy a place. House.
So you can say definitively that those 1 million people do not have that savings. So they cannot pay the rent. They will retire unable to pay the rent. They will be evicted. They will become homeless. Like that is the sort of path we're walking down at the moment. And no politician has even named that problem.
No.
Let alone come up with a set of policies that might solve it.
Well, this is the thing. Scrap the triple lock. I'm saying it now. Scrap the triple lock, spend that money on higher housing benefit for people over 70, okay? I think that's a very horrible policy. I'd obviously have it lower, but if you're trying to be, conservative with it, and put the rest into building social housing, emphasising the needs of older people. And then people start screaming, no, I don't want my pension cut. We're not cutting your pension. We're just saying it's not going to increase as much as it is every year. That's the thing with the triple lock. You're not cutting pensions. It's just a crazy mindset we've somehow allowed ourselves to become engulfed by. It's just remarkable. To be clear, if people who don't know what the triple lock is, every year pensions increase by the 2.5% increase in wages or inflation, whichever is highest. If you just index it to wages, they're still going up. That's going to save you most years, not every year, billions of pounds a year. And that can go to the housing benefit. That can go to building social homes. A crazy policy, a David Cameron policy, no less. We're going to leave it there. Peter, we've been talking for what? 2 hours. I love it. We didn't really talk about the material in this book, your first book, Show Me the Bodies, which has won you a great deal of praise. But this is the book that I think, in terms of a general outline of everything going wrong in the UK housing market, is it's a brilliant place to start. And I always say this for people on Downstream. If you want to radicalize a loved one or a friend, just buy them a book for Christmas. This is a good one.
By Christmas, it will be out in paperback as well. So
and when's it out in paperback?
It's the 25th of September.
There you go. Although the hardback, you might get a slightly bigger royalty. Paperbacks do better. Peter, thanks for joining us on Downstream. Been tremendous, and I've learned so much talking to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.